Here's how to create a glowing thumbnail effect for your YouTube videos, even if you're a total beginner in Photoshop. But to make this process even easier for you, I've created some free gradient presets, layer styles, and a Photoshop action to speed up part of this workflow totally free. You can grab all of that stuff to help with this tutorial in the description below, but with that, let's get started. We'll begin by creating a new document for our YouTube thumbnail by going to New File, or we can press Command or Control N. Now the dimensions for a YouTube thumbnail are a minimum of 1280 by 720 pixels, but you can also just have any document with a 16:9 aspect ratio if you want to work on a larger canvas instead of this. But with this good to go, I'll just click Create, and now we have our canvas to begin working on. I'll start by adding my image assets into this project by locating them on my computer and then dragging and dropping them in. I'll start by selecting my background image, drag it on top of my canvas, and then let go. This places it as a new layer. I'll then repeat this process with the other images. For this thumbnail, I have 3 different layers, but the sparkle texture is one that we're going to use later on, so I'll disable that for now and drag it behind the subject as well. So now we just have the subject layer cut out from the background and then the background image here. If you're unfamiliar with cutting out subjects, you can just use the Select Subject button down here while your image layer is selected, but if you want a more advanced, in-depth look at that process, you can check out my beginner background removal guide in the description below. But to begin, we need to add our colored gradients that will represent our lights for the glow. I want to have a blue gradient on one side and an orange gradient on the other. I'll begin by creating a new layer just by clicking the new layer icon, then grab the gradient tool by pressing G, and I'll make sure I'm using the regular gradient mode, and I'll choose the foreground to transparent gradient in the basics folder. I'll then enable the radial gradient and enable dither, set the method to smooth as well. I'll then go and use the color swatch that I saved for this thumbnail. I just have it here, but you could also go and choose a color for your light source by clicking on the foreground color and then picking a color from your color picker. But with this good to go, you should see the proper color in your gradient up here. And while that new layer is still selected, I'll just click and drag out to create that new gradient like so. This will turn that previously empty layer into a gradient fill layer, and we can just continue to edit this gradient to make it larger or smaller as we need. I'll do something like this for now. I'll now repeat this process on the other side with another gradient in a new color. Once again, clicking on the gradient fill, adding a new layer above that, setting your foreground color to the color of your gradient, and then confirming that you have the foreground to transparent gradient enabled here. I'll now click and drag out from the other side to create the other color for the gradient, and this will just be the base color light sources. Now, if you don't like the look of these, we can always change the layer blending mode of these gradients to something like soft light, or we could try overlay or linear dodge add, depending on what you're into. But in this case, I'm going to leave my gradient set to the normal blending mode and then use a brush to add some more intense lighting effects around the outer edges. I'll begin by creating another new layer at the top. I'll call this to Blue Bright Glow, and then change my foreground color to the same blue as before. I'm just using the color swatch that I saved previously to quickly access that. And I'll grab the brush tool by pressing B, and then while that new layer is still selected in the layers panel, using a soft round brush here, my opacity and flow at 100%, I'll just scale down the brush and paint around the outer edges of the canvas like this. I'll then change the layer blending mode of this layer down to linear dodge add, and we can change the opacity if we feel like it looks too intense. But in this case, I'm just going to continue to paint around the outer edge here so that we have that really bright glowy blue effect on that side. I'll then repeat this process with one more layer, now for the orange side. Choose the same orange for my color swatches in this case, or find it within your color picker, and then we can go and paint over that other corner with the same color of brush, changing the layer blending mode down to linear dodge add, and now we have these nice glowing effects on either side. The final thing that I'll want to do is just add a nice white highlight around the subject to make them pop from the background. So I'll add one more layer at the top. I'll call this to White Subject Glow, and then grab the brush tool, set my foreground color to white this time, click OK. And then with the same soft round brush as before, I'll just go and paint lightly around the outer edges of the subject like this, just to add that nice faint glow coming in from behind them. With these adjustments created, I'll quickly organize the layers, clicking on the topmost white subject glow layer, holding the Shift key, clicking all the way down to the bottom gradient, and then pressing Command or Control G to group them, and I'll call this to background colors. Now we obviously need to add some life to our subject, taking the colors from the background and placing them onto the subject. Now the way we can do this is using a gradient map as well as a black color fill layer so that we can have that nice glowing highlight effect anywhere that we paint. But there's a handful of layers that we need to create every time we do this process. So this is where those free actions and the gradient presets that you can get for free in the description below will come in handy. I'm going to run through how to do this process manually, but again, if you want to speed up some of the stuff I'm about to talk about here, you can go and download those assets below to speed up that process. But for our first step, we need to add a soft blue glow, or the color from your light source, onto the subject's face. So I'll click on the subject layer and add a new color fill, going to the adjustments icon and going up to solid color. I'll then set this color to be the same as my color swatch that I had added in previously, which all my light sources are based on, and I'll click OK. Now we obviously don't want this to cover the entire canvas, so I'll click on the layer mask and press Command or Control I to invert that mask, and now we can selectively paint back that color. Accessing the brush tool by pressing B, I'll set the hardness to 100%, and the opacity and the flow I'll leave to 100% as well. With our foreground color set to white while that layer mask is selected, I can now go and paint this color onto the subject where we want the faint glow to appear. So think of where this color might go and bleed onto our subject's face based on the light source positioning. So I'll go around his cheek there, I want to go around his ear as well, and then some of his hairline too. Once you're happy with where everything has been painted in, we obviously only want this to be restricted to our subject. So I'll click on that color fill, create a new group so that it is within this group now. And we can take the visible pixels of our subject and use that to create a mask for our group. So then that way, any layer we place within this group can only be placed on our subject. To do that, in my case, since I don't have a layer mask, I'll just hold Command or Control and click on the thumbnail of the subject to turn all of the visible pixels on that layer into an active selection. If you had not previously cut out your subject, you'll need to do that first. If you had a layer mask that you used to cut out your subject, well, in that case, you could just hold Command or Control and click on your layer mask thumbnail instead. So again, hold Command or Control, click on your image thumbnail if the background is deleted already, or hold Command or Control and click on your layer mask to create that selection. With the selection active though, we'll click on the group and add a layer mask to isolate this layer within this group to the visible, aka white areas on this mask. Now to go and refine and blend this in a little bit better, I'll grab the brush tool once again, but change the hardness to 0%. And then with that color fill layer mask still selected, our foreground color now set to black, we can go and remove the hard edges from this light and basically just blend it into our subject's face a little bit better. I'll meet you when I've just done all of my brush subtracting here. With that area subtracted, to blend this into our subject's face, we'll click on that color fill layer and change the layer blending mode down here to soft light. So now we'll just get that bit of blue color on their face, and that will give us a nice realistic color tint of the skin based on the light source. If you want to add to this area in any way, just click on the color fill layer mask, set your foreground color to white, and then you can go and add in any of the color as you wish, just going and painting like so with the white brush on that layer mask. Now we have the color added in, but we're missing the main highlight that is coming from our light source. So let's go and add that in next. We'll create that with two different layers. First, creating a brand new layer, and we'll fill this new layer with black by setting our foreground color to black here, and then clicking on that layer and pressing Alt or Option and Delete. This will fill that selected layer with black within the current group. I'll rename this layer to Paint here, and then we'll change the layer blending mode from normal down to screen, which will make it transparent, but we'll be able to paint white on here to add back visibility, as you'll see in just a moment. But this is the layer that we're going to use to paint the glowing effect on. But currently there's no effect on this layer. So to effectively create this glow brush, we just need to use a gradient map with a custom gradient clipped to this current layer. So then anytime we paint on this paint here layer, it will add a really cool glowing brush look. So to begin, let's add that gradient map in next. Then I'll go and add a clipping mask so that this gradient map only affects the paint here black layer. Then I'll click on the gradient map preview, and inside of the gradient editor, we want to have a gradient that goes from black, then we'll have a color matching our light source, and then white. So to add this gradient in, first make sure that we have the black to white gradient selected, then we can click right here within the gradient preview to add a new color stop. We'll then click on the color picker, and then choose a color that matches the background light source in your thumbnail. I'll click OK, and then we can go and move this black point in so that we have a more narrow area of color and then white. So the white and the color is what's going to create that glowing effect. The black will be fully invisible because of our screen blending mode on the Paint Here layer. Now this is essentially the preset that we'll use for all of the glowing thumbnail effects. I've added a handful of these preset styles that you can just go and select from the preset window. You can access all of those down in the description below for free. But anyways, with this good to go, I'll click OK, and then click on the Paint Here layer. Obviously there's nothing happening right now, but if I grab the brush tool by pressing B, set my foreground color to white, because this Paint Here layer is set to screen, that means that anything that is black will not be visible on that layer. However, when we go and paint white on here, what it does is it applies the effect from the gradient map onto any visible brush strokes here. So because our gradient map had black, which is going to be transparent on our screen blending mode, all we see is the white and the color, which will allow us to create a nice highlight or rim light around the subject. I'll just undo that and then begin by changing my brush flow down to something like 20 to 50%, and I'm using a soft round brush. I'll now go and just paint around any areas that I want a highlight to appear. So I'll begin just by painting along this area here, scaling up the brush, painting over again, and I'll just repeat this all the way around any areas that I want this to appear. So around the jawline, around the edge of the neck, I'll add some small brush strokes around the ear like this. And we'll do some extra blending to make this look more realistic after as well. But for now, we're just setting in the base colors for this effect, or the base highlights for this effect. Now with those areas added within the subject, I'll change the flow back to 100%. And now what we can do is use the Shift key while clicking between each brush stroke to create straight lines. So if I click once, it creates a dot. If I hold the Shift key, it'll create a straight line between those two clicks. So with that in mind, I can just go and click near the edge of the subject and then hold the Shift key and just continue to click while holding Shift, and it will create that nice straight line for me all the way around the edge of them to create that realistic looking rim light. Now I'm going to repeat this all the way around the subject, so I'll meet you when that's complete. Now we have the base colors added in, but they don't look very nice. So what we can do is use a couple of options. First, using the Smudge tool to make things look more streaked and pointy, and then we can subtract from the Paint Here layer to fix any areas that we might have messed up in. So I'll begin by just clicking on the Paint Here layer still, and I'll access the Smudge tool nested underneath the Blur and Sharpen tool. I'll set the mode to normal. I'm using a soft round brush, and for the strength, you can do anything above 30%. Now from here, what I'll do is use the Smudge tool just to click and drag on some of these brush adjustments to make them look a little bit more blended. We can make them thinner, we can stretch them out and make the glow a bit more soft just by clicking and dragging out like that. And that way we can basically isolate this effect to look a little bit more realistic, as if we were using a pen tablet, but in this case, I'm just using a mouse. If we hover our cursor just near the edge of the highlight and drag out, it will allow us to pull some of that blue color out from the glow rather than just the white. So that way we can add some more nice lighting effects into this blend. If you find that the smudge adjustment isn't doing enough of pulling the colors out, you can go and increase the strength again. So I'm now at 80%, and then now we can just pull out from that highlight and it will allow us to create a bit of a more streaked effect. So we can pull it around the hair and things like that. After you're finished your smudging effects, you'll likely have too much visible and it won't look exactly as you hope for. So now we can go and subtract from our Paint Here layer. To subtract from this layer, we'll just set our foreground color to black. Access the brush tool by pressing B. I'll choose the soft round brush and we'll use the opacity and the flow setting. We'll use both of these at a very low amount. In this case, I have a 30% opacity and a 30% flow. So that way we can just go and paint over the glowing effects to subtract from them very subtly. So I'll just continue to do this, painting over the same area multiple times if I want to remove more of it. So then that way we can begin to isolate this effect a little bit better just to the areas that we want it to be visible in. I'll meet you when all this is finished. If you go and subtract a little bit too much, we can then change our foreground color back to white and then just add back any areas that we want that light source with a low flow and opacity once again. So then that way we just get that nice soft glow all around our subject. Now the final step that we can do is also add a bit more of a highlight around this area by going back to our color fill layer, and then we'll duplicate it by pressing Command or Control J. This is going to create the same color fill layer, but we want to have a new fresh black layer mask. So I'll just click on that layer mask, set my foreground color to black, and then hold Alt or Option and Delete to fill that mask with black. With that layer mask set to black, I'll change the layer blending mode up to Linear Dodge Add, and then now while we're using a soft round brush with a 100% opacity and a low flow, we can now just go and paint around the subject to add an additional bit of a blue glow wherever we want around the photo. Now, if this looks too intense, just go ahead and lower the fill for that layer like so. So then that way we just get this nice blended look like this. Now I'm just doing this relatively quickly. You can go and touch up all of the highlights around your subject to make the lighting look a little bit more realistic, but this is ultimately the base process. Once this is finished, we'll go and repeat this on the other side. So I'm just going to go ahead and quickly do that, repeating all the same steps that we did here, starting with a color fill layer in soft light matching the light source. Then we'll create the paint here layers and the gradient map, and then if we want to add any extra lighting, we'll use an additional color fill layer. But once that is finished, we'll have some extra effects that you might want to consider to improve your thumbnails after you apply the glowing effect. So I'll meet you when the other half is complete. So repeating that same process now on the other side, I just created a second group. So all my orange adjustments are on one side, all of my blue adjustments are on the other. But now that the glow effect is applied, remember that you'll want to zoom out of the canvas to see how this would look when it's viewed as a YouTube thumbnail within a grid of other videos on the channel. But we can make this look a little bit better by adding in some extra stuff to the background. So I'll begin by first changing some of the layer blending modes in the background. I'll go to my background colors here within the group, and I'll start by changing the layer blending modes of the background gradients. I'll try something like Linear Dodge Add for both the orange and the blue gradients. That way it just has a little bit more brightness in the background, and I think that matches the subject a bit better. I'll then go and enable my sparkles texture that I had added in previously, but I'll change the layer blending mode down here to screen, so it's going to remove all of the black from that texture. But it looks really overexposed right now because it is behind all of the background colors. So I'll go and drag this above the background colors like so. Finally, the background colors just look a little too intense, so I'll click on that group, go to the opacity, and then drag this down so that it looks a little bit less bright in the background. Now finally, we could go and add a little bit of darkening just along the bottom of the subject. I'll create a new exposure adjustment directly above the subject layer, and then add a clipping mask so it only affects the subject image. I'll then bring down the exposure just slightly and decrease the offset to add some contrast in there. And then while clicking on that layer mask, I'll press Command or Control I to invert it, so we can then set our foreground color to white, use our soft round brush with a 100% opacity, and then just go and paint onto that layer mask to selectively darken some of the bottom of the subject here like so. Now we have successfully added in our lighting adjustments, so turning those on and then off, you can see the difference that we have there. Now in this example, I was doing this a little bit more rushed. Some of these brush adjustments I would take a bit more time to improve. I'll show you the before and after that I have finished after I spent a bit more time on this, but ultimately the same process will apply. You'll just need to spend a little bit more time if you want everything to look absolutely perfect. But again, remember that this technique isn't about creating something realistic. It's about creating something that is clickable and stands out among a sea of other thumbnails. So just always take a view of your thumbnail at a distance to notice if there's anything that is looking a bit off. Now again, if you want to go and speed up a lot of this process in the future, you can download the free resources bundle below that has the actions that will create some of these layers for you. It has some gradient presets as well as some layer styles that you can apply to text if you want your text to have some glowing effects as well. Again, all that is in the description or pinned comment below, but with that, I'll see you next time.